Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. After having a couple of requests recently for the Moondrop Aria review, I asked on the channel if people wanted me to bring it forwards, and generally most of you said no, just review it when you get there. Funnily enough, what I hadn't looked at yet was that another IEM I'm reviewing, the Cat Ear here, happens to be an identically priced IEM to the Moondrop Aria. So I'm addressing two IEMs at once here today by reviewing both the Cat Ear and the Moondrop Aria and putting them head to head as two identically priced $80 IEMs. So stick around as I explain what the pros and cons are of each and which one I would choose out of the two. Without giving anything away, I'm going to tell you it's a lot closer than you might think given some of the hype around the Aria. So stay tuned and I'll explain it all. Before we get into the details though, there's a couple of things I want to cover off. Firstly, I want to say a huge thanks to Melbourne Chi-Fi Audio for getting me in touch with Cat Ear to arrange the Mia sample to be sent over, and also to Shenzhen Audio for sending me the Moondrop Aria for review. As always, when retailers are kind enough to send me products for review, I will put their links down below so you can say thank you to them for sending this out and making this review possible. The one final thing that I want to mention before we dive in today is that I'm currently testing the Sennheiser MKE 200 camera microphone. It's like a little shotgun directional microphone designed for DSLRs and smartphones. So I've got that recording some of the audio today as well as my usual setup, and at some point during this video I'm going to flip over to the Sennheiser, see how it sounds, let you hear it, and I'd really appreciate your comments as to how you find the audio captured on the Sennheiser, and I'll put it on screen when I do that. Let me know in the comments if you think it's a good sound, not good sound, what you like about it, what you don't like about it. Put it all in the comments down below. I'm really keen for your input. For now though, let's jump into the review by tackling these first of all one at a time and then looking at them in comparison. So we're going to start with the Moondrop Aria because that's the one that's been getting the most conversation. So as you've just seen, the Aria is a fairly common shape, being that sort of semi-molded style that many of the IEMs coming out today seem to adopt. I personally think it looks beautiful, and it definitely feels beautiful well with those lovely metal shells. It's got nice accents, but it's not too over the top and garish. So if you want something more subtle, the Arias could be a good choice. The cable they come with is also quite nice. It's a fabric wrapped cable that does feel a little bit budget, but at the same time, I think it's good enough for what I expect in an $80 IEM. I think if I had to pick any holes in the accessories provided with the Arias, it's going to come down to this teeny tiny little case, which for me is just a bit too small for comfort. You can fit the Arias rolled up in there, as you can see here, and even fit some spare tips, but it's a bit of a squeeze, and I don't like the idea of the shells of the IEM rubbing together the whole time. I think it is going to lead to chipping and scratching of the paint. The other thing that I'm not hugely thrilled by, but it's also not a deal breaker, are the tips. The tips provided are a nice enough silicone tip, but they're all much the same, and they're not the nicest silicone tip that I've tried when I've seen other options coming out with, I think, much better tips. And the Mias are going to be an example of that shortly. So all in all, I think the Arias are okay, they're fine, they're what I'd expect in terms of design and accessories, but they're not class leading in terms of design and accessories. The shells themselves are nice, they're clearly very well made, they're a little bit heavy compared to some of the alternatives out there, and they don't fit quite as well as I would like, particularly because the nozzle on them is fairly thick. So by the time you combine the semi-molded style with the angle of the nozzle and the thickness of the nozzle, they're going to fit some people really well, and other people like me, okay, but not as perfectly as I might like. They're not as good, for example, as something like the recently reviewed C Audio Yuma that just nestled in my ear and kind of disappeared once I started wearing it. So I think overall I'd give the Arias a pass, definitely, on their design and their accessories, but they're not setting the world on fire for me. That said, when you're spending $80 on an IEM, I think what you're probably looking for is not so much the best designed IEM in the world, but a really good sounding IEM that's obviously quite affordable. And the Arias do mostly deliver on that, I think. The smoothness and the delivery from the driver in the Arias, I think, is excellent. So let's talk about the tuning of the Arias in general. They've got a quite neutral tuning with a slight tilt towards treble and that sort of presence region of vocals. So it's in that upper mids, lower treble range. They've just got a little bit of extra push for me. The Arias also offer quite good detail retrieval, and it's probably because of a bit of extra treble emphasis that I've already alluded to, bringing out some of the subtle textural details and really making them kind of a detail-oriented budget IEM. The bass is there, it's good, it extends quite well, but it's just a secondary element in the overall signature compared to the treble and that presence in the upper end of the vocals. It's not a tuning that I find particularly enjoyable for long listening sessions, but it is a tuning that I find interesting to listen to and I find kind of enjoyable but not entirely natural at all times. In the scheme of things for a budget IEM, I do think it's a very good tuning, but it's going to be a tuning that suits some people and not all people. That slightly bright, or maybe I should say slightly lean tuning, does lend itself to having a decent spacious soundstage, particularly at the price. I think the soundstaging is quite good. It's not overly spacious, but it's certainly not cramped or closed in like some other budget IEMs can be. Overall, I think the Arias are quite a nice IEM, but I don't think they're a guaranteed winner for everybody because they do have some pros and cons that are worth taking into account. And that leads me over to the Mia, because the Mia also has some pros and cons, but it's also worth taking into account. It's not an IEM that you've probably heard of, and that's partly why I wanted to pair it up with the Aria to give you a chance to hear about another IEM that you may never have heard of otherwise, but one that I think is worth knowing about. The Mia uses quite a different design, so let's take a quick look at some glamour video of it to give you a sense of what we're talking about. As you've just seen, the Mia is more of what I call a bullet style IEM, so it's a straight barrel that goes straight into the ear and sticks out a little bit. It's always going to be, in my opinion, less ergonomic than something like a molded style or semi-molded style like the Arias, but at the same time, it can give you easier insertion depending on the angle of your ear canal and the size and the shape of it. So in that sense, these two are kind of a draw on ergonomics. They both have their problems, but they both work okay. Things are also quite different in terms of the way these are designed. Even though they're both using a dynamic driver, the Mias are not using a liquid silicon driver. They're using a normal plastic style driver, but a driver and I believe potentially an entire housing and all of the wiring that goes into it that's been cryo-treated. Now some of you might instantly say that cryo-treating doesn't do anything, but I've actually spoken to people in the past, including Dan Schmolley from Bottlehead in my interviews with him, where we actually discussed cryo-treatment. And one of the things that he'd found in his testing and his experiments over the years was that cryo-treatment, in his opinion, basically speeds up the burning process. So the theory behind cryo-treatment is that it helps to change the molecular alignment within the metals of the electronic devices, and that can actually speed up the process that you would otherwise get from extended flow of current. Now, whether cryo goes above and beyond that explanation, I'm not sure, and I haven't looked into it at length to fully understand it, but it is something that seems to alter the sound qualities of the devices it's used on. However, it may not alter it any further than normal burn-in and use of the device will do. So with that in mind, I'm going to say that the two technologies in both the Aria and the Mia, to me, are a bit of a wash. Neither of them is absolutely groundbreaking. They both might be bringing good things to the table, but realistically, you shouldn't buy one over the other because of its flagship technology. I really don't think it makes that much difference. You can use whatever technology you want in an earphone, but if it's not designed well, tuned well, it doesn't fit well, if any of those things aren't right, the technology means nothing. So with that in mind, I think technology-wise, it's a bit of a wash. So let's talk about a couple of other things that I think the Mia does better than the Aria before I talk about the Mia's sound and then a comparison of the sounds together. So back to the Mia solely for a moment, we've got a really nice kind of twisted style cable with a rubber sheathing on the outside and nice plugs. I don't think it feels more expensive than the Aria cable. I prefer it slightly to the Aria cable, but I don't think it's clearly better. It's just a preference thing. A couple of things I do like better is the Mias come with this nice little, I think it's a fake leather case. I don't really care whether it's leather or not leather. The point for me that I like is it's a little bit more spacious. It's a pouch that you can open up and actually fit a reasonable amount of stuff inside with a bit more room. The IEMs can still rub together, so that's a bit of a drawback for me, but I think it's a little bit more spacious than the teeny tiny case that comes with the Moondrops. The final thing, and I've already touched on this a little bit, is that with the Mias, you get a range of tips. So you can actually choose from a couple of different tips, and the tip quality in general, I find better quality than what comes with the Arias. The Aria tips feel like the cheapest possible silicon tip, whereas these feel like a nice mid-tier silicon that you'd also get with IEMs in the $100 to $200 sort of dollar range. Now I just said that the tips were the last thing because I nearly forgot one other really key point, and that is the tuning rings that are available for the Mias. Now the reason I forgot them is that I think most people are going to put them in place and leave them in place, but you do have the choice. To explain what I'm talking about, there are tiny little O-rings provided with the Mias that fit over where the MMCX connector goes for the cable and actually close off or limit airflow from some vents in the housing of the Mias. What that does is it changes the frequency response of the Mias and their overall presentation as a result. Whilst I quite like both presentations of the Mias, I do prefer them with the tuning rings in place, and although it's a real fiddle to put them on and take them off, and it's very easy to break them, as I discovered when I received these, and both of them were broken or broke as I removed them with very, very little force. So I don't know if they'd been used and already stretched too far. I don't know if they'd been affected by heat. I'm not sure what was going on there, but they broke almost instantly when I went to remove the cables. Thankfully there were 2 spares in the box. I was able to get them on after much effort, and they do make a good difference to the sound. So it's nice to have the tuning option available, but I do think most people are going to put the tuning rings on and leave them on. And to explain why, let's talk now about sound quality. So I'm going to talk first of all about the Mias with no tuning rings because that's how I heard them first. Without the tuning rings, they're quite a warm, rich sounding earphone. They produce quite an intimate soundstage, but quite a wide, spacious soundstage. And I know that sounds a bit of a contradiction, but what I mean by that is the instruments and vocals are right up close to you, but there's a good sense of space in terms of width and also space between each of the instruments. So I quite like their presentation in that regard. The bass extension from them, as you'd expect based on their warm, rich sound, is excellent. It's got a really nice, deep, thumpy bass that's fairly well controlled for a budget IEM. Where things do fall down a bit though is that detail retrieval is not the best. They're a little bit too rich and too warm without those tuning rings, and whilst the pink tips that you'll see on them in the Glamour video do improve that compared to the other tips in the box, they're still not great in the detail retrieval space, particularly if you've listened to the Arias side by side. The final issue I have using the Mias without the tuning rings in place is that the tonality can get just a little bit boxy sometimes. As you'll see from the graph on screen, the tuning ring produces a bit of extra energy through all of the mid-range space of the IEM and up into the treble, and it just pushes some of those mid-range frequencies a little bit far and produces this unnatural boxy tonality. One example of this, and I'll talk a lot more about it later, was on the track Santa Monica Dream by Angus and Julia Stone. On that track, the opening guitar work sounded just a little bit off when I was listening to the Mia. It sounded a bit boxy and a bit unnatural, particularly when comparing to the Aria. But I'll talk more about that soon. I just want to give you an idea of the sorts of things that don't sound right, and the guitar is a great example. So having listened to the Mias without the tuning ring, I then went, and as I said before, with much effort, managed to get the tuning rings in place. Now these tuning rings are absolutely tiny, as you'll see in the Glamour video, and so it's really hard to work with them and get them to stretch over the MMCX socket to where they need to go to seal up those ports. It's not something you're going to want to do over and over again. It's not quick and easy like changing tips on, say, a Shure SE846 or even something like the JVCs that I reviewed once upon a time. It's not a quick and easy tuning change. This is a decision you're probably going to want to make once and then leave it. So let's talk about the sound with those tuning rings in place. The sound with the tuning rings immediately becomes a little bit less intimate, a little bit more neutral, and overall more enjoyable and more tonally accurate. As you can see from the graph, the extension in the bass is still fantastic, so you're not losing out on bass extension, all you're doing is bringing the mids and some of that lower treble into a better level of balance with the rest of the sound signature. So for me, it's a really clear-cut decision. Having those tuning rings in place makes the Mia a really nice $80 IEM. Having them not in place, they're interesting, they're not bad, but I don't think I'd recommend them without. Having those tuning rings in place improves tonality, it improves detail retrieval, and it allows the bass to feel extended, but also a bit cleaner and a little bit tighter. So for me, there's really no reason to not use those rings unless you like a really rich, thick sound through the mids. So having covered off each IEM on its own, let's now put them head to head with the cat ear Mia with tuning rings and the pink tips that they come with up against the Moondrop Arias. Now I've emphasized the pink tips that the Mias come with because they do come with two different sets of tips. I'm only comparing these based on the tips that they come with because otherwise we introduce way too many variations. So working with the pink tips that come stock with the Mias, not the sort of black and colored tips that you'll have seen in the Glamour video, putting them with the pink tips up against the Moondrop Arias. The comparison between the two shows that they're both excellent IEMs with a different presentation. The Arias are clearly the more resolving IEM, but that's going to come at the cost potentially of a slightly more fatiguing sound signature. As you'll see from the graph on screen, the overall treble is a bit smoother with less peaks and troughs and bumps, and I'm talking the Aria being smoother compared to the Mia. But the Aria does have this quite large peak at the upper end of the treble. What that means is it puts an undue amount of emphasis at that upper end of the spectrum, and I think that's been done to create the sense of detail retrieval and textual information to bring out some of those really, really fine cues that you may not normally hear. But at the same time, it does throw off the overall tonality of what would otherwise be a wonderful, wonderful earphone. Now, I'm not saying it's bad because of that, but I am saying it throws off the tonality a bit, and I think it's something you need to take into account if you're looking at buying the Arias. In comparison, the Mias are less resolving, but with those tuning rings in place and the pink tips on, they are still a good resolving earphone at that sort of $80 price range. What they've got going for them, despite that slightly peaky treble you can see in the graph, is a more even and natural tonality through the mid-range. However, the treble isn't as smooth and isn't as clean sounding as it is from the Aria, so we do have trade-offs going on here, and a lot of this is going to come down to your overall sound signature preference, recognizing that both IEMs have their benefits and their drawbacks. In terms of sound staging, the Arias produce a sense of better space between you and the music, but at the same time don't feel as wide and as spacious overall in terms of the width of the soundstage and the individual space between instruments. So the Mias, on the other hand, bring everything a bit closer and a bit more intimate, but there's a better sense of separation between each of the sounds. In terms of bass, both extend very, very well, but I think overall the slightly warmer tuning of the Mias means they come across as having a bit more punch and quantity in the bass without going too far, but a bit more punch and quantity because they're better balanced with the treble because they don't have that huge spike in the treble that the Arias have up around that 14k mark. To help clarify all this, let me talk now through a few different tracks that I listened to with both of these IEMs to see where they excelled and where they maybe fell back a bit. The first track in the list was Velvet Rope by Janet Jackson. On this track, the details were a bit more obvious and a bit more present from the Aria. It sort of pushed them forward a little bit, both for better and for worse at times. Velvet Rope's got some interesting kind of clicky, harsh electronic sounds in the very opening section, and it made them a little bit overdone at times. It made me think maybe there was something wrong. In the case of the Mia, those were still there, but they didn't feel quite as out of touch with the rest of the music. Now, I don't know which is correct or incorrect from the production producer's point of view, so I'm not going to say which was better or worse, but I certainly found it a little bit off-putting from the Aria in that particular situation. The other thing that Velvet Rope showed me was that the extension on the bass from both was excellent, but as I've already said, the Mia had just that little bit more sense of punch in the bass that I think that track warrants, and it did help it to be a more overall engaging and enjoyable listen on the Mia compared to the Aria. So for electronic, R&B, hip-hop, things like that where that bit of extra bass punch and thump and kind of power is important, I do think the Mias are going to be the better choice. But obviously there's many more genres in the world, so let's talk now about something completely different in A Santa Monica Dream by Angus and Julia Stone. Now I mentioned this before that with the tuning rings not in place, the Mias didn't sound quite right on the guitars. So when I came back around to compare the two of them, I put this track on again so I could specifically try that same piece of guitar work with both the Arias and the Mias, with the Mias now having the tuning ring in place. And what I heard was that now the Mias were better on tonality. I felt like the Mias captured the richness of the harmonics from the guitar just a little bit better than the Arias, which tended to draw your attention more to the texture and less to the harmonic richness of the guitar string vibrating. It's not a big separation here, and indeed it's quite fun to hear the way the Arias present that sound, but I don't necessarily think I preferred the Arias over the Mias, and probably would lean slightly towards the Mias for the tonality of that guitar. Turning my attention to the vocals, what I noticed was that the breathiness of the vocals, particularly Julia Stone, who has a very breathy voice, that was more pronounced from the Moondrop Aria. I think again it was maybe a touch overdone from the Aria, but before you think that's a negative, what I did find was that the Mias came across a bit grainy on the vocals with that particular recording. It's probably due to all those spikes that you would have seen before in the treble of the Mias, whereas the general treble, other than that one big spike, the general treble of the Arias is a bit smoother across the board. And I think that results in an overall smoother presentation of treble that certainly worked better for Angus and Julia Stone's voices. So on this particular track, it was kind of a draw between the two. I think the Mia handled the tonality of the guitar slightly better, but I think the Arias did really nice things with the texture of the guitar strings, and the vocals were definitely more pleasing, even if slightly enhanced from the Arias. So I felt like I needed one more track to really separate these two, because they're both doing really good things and both having some drawbacks. The final track for this test is one that's not particularly well recorded, but gives me a good insight into the ability of each IEM to engage me in the music and give a sense of groove when it's needed, and that is City Beneath the Sea by Harry Connick Jr. Being a slower, New Orleans influenced funk track requires a bit of soul, a bit of groove, and a bit of richness to the sound that in this case the Mia could do really, really well, and the Aria fell a bit short of. The Aria had me focusing on Harry's vocals once again due to that overemphasis in the treble, and I never felt like I was engaged and drawn into the music and wanted to tap my foot or kind of just groove along with the music. In the case of the Mia though, while still not being a perfect IEM, it definitely had me much more engaged and involved in the music. To me, the Mia has some punch, some soul, and some character, whereas I feel like the Aria is trying to lean too heavily on technicalities and crispness of sound to its own detriment on certain tracks. So to bring this all to a conclusion, I think both of these IEMs are actually excellent for the $80 price tag. And I think the decision that you've got to make if you're looking at buying one of these is what exactly are you looking for? On general tonality, engagement, naturalness of sound, I think when the tuning ring's installed and the pink tip's on, I think the Mia actually wins out. It's a more engaging and more natural sounding IEM. As I said, it does have some issues with graininess in treble sometimes, but it's very forgivable and very enjoyable overall. On the flip side, I think the Arias win in terms of technicalities, detail retrieval, resolution, but it's going to come at the cost of drawing your attention to those details and not necessarily just engaging you in the music. And that's why I say it really depends on what you're looking for with these two. I think the Aria wins slightly on treble quality because of that smoothness that I mentioned compared to the slight graininess from the Mia, but as I said before, I do think the Mia is quite forgivable for that graininess. It's not nasty, it's just something I noticed in comparison only, and so it's not a reason I would choose one over the other, but it is something to be aware of. Finally, I think in terms of ergonomics and comfort, it's pretty split. I'm not personally a fan of bullets, but I did find the bullet style approach of the Mia, in this case, to be more comfortable for me than the semi-molded style of the Arias that didn't quite suit my ear geometry properly. So as I've already alluded to, and you've probably gathered from the points that I've just gone through, both of these IEMs are kind of equal and neck in terms of their overall pros and cons. Both have good benefits, both have drawbacks, and ultimately it's going to come down to which sound style you prefer. Do you want engaging and rich and enjoyable? In that case, go for the Mia. Do you want technicalities and detail retrieval and texture? In that case, go for the Aria. It's really going to come down to that. I don't think it can go too far wrong with either. I would happily enjoy listening to either for an extended period with no problems at all. If you were to put the thumb screws on me and really force me to choose one, I would choose the Mia out of the two, but that's because my preference will always go towards engagement and richness of sound, not warmth and thickness, but just a richer harmonic experience. The Mias win out for me in that regard. So I would personally, forgo the hype train and choose the Mias, but it's not because they're hands down better than the Arias, it's because they have a tonality and a presentation that I personally prefer. If you prefer technicalities and texture, then the choice is easy and it's not the wrong choice by any stretch. So hopefully you found this review useful in separating these two, potentially introducing you to the Mia if you hadn't heard it before. Do have a think about it as a great alternative to the Arias if you're in that $80 ballpark. I hope you found this review useful. If you have, please think about hitting the subscribe button and hit the like button to help this review get in front of more people just like you. And also don't forget that if you like the sound of either of these and you'd like to buy a pair for yourself, do please use the links below for either Shenzhen Audio in the case of the Moondrops or Melbourne Hi-Fi Audio in the case of the Mias. There's no affiliates or kickbacks, it's just a way to say thank you. For now though, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.